The evening sun dipped low as the man turned onto his quiet street, his steps slow, his mind tired from a long day. The neighborhood looked peaceful at first glance, but beneath the silence there was tension, a heaviness that always followed the shadow of the HOA. He reached his mailbox and pulled it open. Inside sat a stack of envelopes, the usual bills, the usual notices, but one envelope stood out, thicker, heavier, marked with the HOA's seal. His brows tightened as he pulled it free, the paper rough against his fingers. He tore it open without waiting and unfolded the long sheet inside. His eyes moved quickly across the numbers, then froze. The amount glared back at him like fire. $5,000. His electricity bill had been hiked beyond reason. His chest tightened but his face stayed calm. His lips pressed into a thin line. He stood there unmoving as neighbors began to notice. They drifted closer in twos and threes, whispering among themselves. Some covered their mouths, others smirked. The whispers grew louder. It had happened again. Another victim of the HOA's ruthless control. Across the street Karen stood with her arms folded, her red jacket bright under the fading sun. She leaned slightly toward a group of neighbors, her smirk sharp and cruel. She spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. She said this was what happened when someone thought they could defy her rules. This was punishment. This was order. The neighbors nodded nervously. Some forced small laughs, but their eyes betrayed unease. They all knew Karen's hunger for power had no limits. The man remained still, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. But he did not shout. He did not curse. He did not march across the street to face her. Instead he lowered the bill slowly and looked at his house, then at the street, then finally at Karen, his gaze cold, colder than the evening air, his silence heavier than any word. Karen caught his eyes and for a split second her smile flickered, but pride forced it back into place. She laughed loudly, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. She told the crowd that the man would have no choice but to pay. No one escaped her reach. The man turned away and walked into his house, the bill still in his hand. He closed the door behind him softly, the sound echoing in the street louder than a slam. Inside his house the air felt darker. He placed the bill on the table and sat down, staring at it as if it were an enemy. He read it again and again, each line sharper than the last. The numbers screamed at him, the charges twisted and cruel, but his face never broke. His mind worked quietly, turning over every possibility. Outside, neighbors continued whispering, some mocking him, some feeling pity. Karen's laughter floated faintly through the window, sharp and unrelenting. She believed she had broken him. She believed her power was untouchable. But inside the house a storm was forming, silent and controlled. The man rose from the table, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. He looked across the street at Karen, still boasting to the neighbors, his eyes steady, unblinking. Karen noticed and stiffened for a moment, though she tried to hide it with another laugh. The man let the curtain fall and turned back to the table. He picked up the bill, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. Then he sat down in the dim light, his hands clasped together, his silence deepening, his thoughts sharpening. He remembered the last time Karen had targeted a neighbor, how she had fined them for a minor garden decoration, how she had stood proud while their family struggled. He remembered the stories whispered late at night, the threats, the rules bent to her will, and now she had come for him. But unlike the others, he did not fear the weight of her paper threats. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his face calm, his breath slow. Yet in his chest a quiet fire burned, one that did not roar but smoldered, waiting. The night grew darker, the street outside emptied, neighbors retreating to their homes. But Karen's light stayed on late, her silhouette visible as she moved from room to room, no doubt celebrating another small victory. The man watched through the curtain once before turning away. He opened a small notebook and began to write, his pen scratching softly. He was not writing anger or curses, he was writing facts, details, numbers, the quiet evidence of her fraud, each line another step toward something she could not see coming. Hours passed and the house grew silent. The bill rested in the drawer like a weapon waiting to be drawn. The man finally stood, turned off the lamp, and walked to the window one last time. The street was dark except for Karen's house glowing arrogantly. He whispered nothing, he smiled not at all. His silence was complete. But in that silence was a promise, a storm waiting. And though Karen believed she had crushed him with her $5,000 blow, she had in truth only lit the fuse of her own downfall. And the man, calm as the night, was ready to let it burn. The next morning the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Word of the man's $5,000 electric bill had spread like fire. Some neighbors shook their heads in pity while others laughed behind their hands. Children repeated the story as if it were gossip from a schoolyard, saying their parents warned them this is what happens when someone crosses the HOA president. By noon Karen had already arranged a meeting in the community hall. She loved nothing more than turning her victories into public theater. She wore her signature red jacket, her hair pulled tight, her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. She walked through the hall like a queen entering her throne room. Her allies clapped as she entered. Others clapped out of fear, some stayed silent, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The man arrived too, not because he wanted to hear her lies, but because he wanted to watch. He stood at the back of the room, his posture calm, his eyes steady, carrying no folder, no papers, only silence. Karen spotted him instantly and her smile grew sharper. She raised her voice so the whole hall could hear. She waved the copy of his bill like a trophy, the crisp paper fluttering in her manicured hand. She declared loudly that the HOA had taught the man a lesson, that his arrogance had finally met its match. She said that no one, no matter where they came from, could live in their neighborhood without obeying her rules. Laughter scattered through the crowd, some nervous, some genuine. Neighbors who feared her clapped harder than needed, while others sat stiff, their eyes darting toward the man at the back, waiting for him to react, but he did not. His face remained unreadable, his silence thicker than the air in the room. Karen paced back and forth at the front, her heels clicking like hammers, each step punctuating her words. She reminded everyone of past fines, past victories. She named families who had fallen before her, twisting their struggles into her glory. The man remembered each name, each story, each injustice. He kept his eyes fixed on her, calm as stone. Karen's voice grew louder as she mocked him directly, calling him careless, saying he thought he was above the rules, that he believed he could challenge her power. But now he had been reduced to nothing more than an example. Neighbors turned their heads toward him, expecting anger, expecting defense. But still he gave them nothing. The silence unsettled even those who cheered Karen. They whispered among themselves. Why didn't he fight back? Why didn't he shout? Why did he stand so calmly when his name was dragged through the dirt? Karen mistook that silence for weakness. She thought his stillness meant surrender, so she pressed harder, her words sharper. She said he would pay every cent, and when he did, she would double the fines if he so much as blinked at her rules again. Her laughter rang through the hall, high and cruel, echoing against the walls. The sound bounced back almost mocking her. Still the man did not move, his eyes on her, cold and steady. The crowd's energy shifted, the laughter faltered, the claps softened. Some neighbors felt a strange chill in the room, as though the silence carried more power than her shouting. When the meeting ended, Karen basked in the weak applause of her followers. She walked out of the hall like a victor returning from war, waving her hands, speaking loudly so everyone outside could hear. She told them the man had been crushed, that he was broken. But as she walked past him at the back, she caught his eyes for a split second, and what she saw made her heartbeat quicken. His gaze was not defeated, it was not weak. It was the gaze of someone who had already decided something she could not guess. She turned away quickly, forcing another laugh. But the sound cracked at the edges. The man stepped out into the sunlight quietly, his silence following him like a shadow. Neighbors lingered in small groups outside, whispering, their eyes moving from Karen's forced smile to the man's calm retreating figure. The story of the meeting spread through the night. Some repeated Karen's words, some laughed at her mockery, but others whispered that the man's silence was not weakness, that it was something else, something stronger. Karen sat in her living room later, sipping wine, replaying the scene in her head. She told herself she had won. She told herself she had humiliated him. But deep down a sliver of unease cut at her. She could not shake the memory of his eyes, unblinking, calm, cold. She brushed it off with another laugh, telling herself that silence meant surrender, that she had nothing to fear. But the man, sitting at his own desk across the street, unfolded the bill again and stared at the numbers, then slowly placed it back into the drawer, his hand steady, his face calm. Inside him the storm grew sharper, not loud, not wild, but cold and focused. He knew Karen had written her own downfall in the lines of this bill. And all he had to do was wait, watch, and strike when the time was right. Outside the night deepened, lights glowed from every house, but his window stayed dim, his silence wrapping the street like a warning. A silence that made the neighbors who had mocked him earlier shift uneasily in their beds, wondering why they could not shake the image of his calm figure standing in the back of the hall, watching, waiting, while Karen shouted herself hoarse at shadows. The night after the humiliating meeting stretched long and heavy. The man sat alone in his house, the bill lying open on the table before him. The numbers stared at him like sharp knives. $5,000. An impossible weight, yet his face carried no panic, no fear, only calm silence. Outside, Karen's laughter still echoed faintly across the street. She had invited a few loyal neighbors into her brightly lit living room. Her red jacket tossed across the chair as she poured wine and bragged about her victory. Her voice rose again and again, repeating how she had crushed the outsider with one bill, how she had proved once more that no one escaped her control. The neighbors forced laughter, though. Some eyes darted nervously toward the man's dark house across the street. While Karen filled her home with noise, his home remained quiet. The lamp on his desk cast a pale glow as he pulled a small notebook toward him. His pen scratched steadily across the page, writing not anger but details. He noted the charges, the meter numbers, the dates, his hand precise, his breathing slow. He flipped to another page where old receipts were neatly folded, each showing months of steady bills. None higher than a few hundred. Now suddenly 5,000. The difference itself told a story of manipulation. His silence thickened as he pieced it together, the pattern clear. This was not just an error, it was a deliberate strike. Karen's pride wrapped in paper. He closed the notebook softly and leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving to the window where Karen's house glowed like a stage, her silhouette moving, her arms waving as she spoke. He imagined her telling them he was finished, that he would crawl back and beg, but his lips pressed into a thin line, the silence inside him turning into steel. The next morning, the man walked calmly to the county office. He spoke little, but his words carried weight. He requested copies of meter readings, official documents, anything tied to his property. The clerk looked surprised at his request. Few people bothered to question HOA decisions, but she handed him a folder filled with stamped papers. He thanked her quietly and left. Outside the office he opened the folder on a bench, the sun glinting off the stamped seals. The numbers confirmed what he already knew. The readings were altered, the charges fabricated. The HOA had overstepped its power, and now he held proof. He closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked home with the same steady steps. That evening, while neighbors mowed lawns and children played, he sat again at his desk, spreading out the documents, every page another weapon, every signature another nail in Karen's coffin. He did not rush, he did not fume, he only studied, patient as a hunter. Outside the whispers began to shift. Some neighbors now wondered aloud if Karen had gone too far. Others lowered their voices when the man passed, uncertain of his silence. Karen, blind to the change, continued her campaign. She walked door to door in her red jacket, boasting loudly that she had finally brought the outsider to his knees. She told them to prepare for the example she would make of him. But behind her back, some rolled their eyes, some muttered that she was obsessed. The man heard it all but never answered. He walked past her once on the street. She stopped and smirked, asking if he had his check ready, if he was ready to pay his debt to the HOA. Her voice sharp, meant to cut. But he only looked at her for a moment, his gaze cold, then walked on without a word. Her smirk faltered as the silence pressed against her louder than an insult. Later that night he sat again with the papers, the binder of evidence growing thicker, his notes sharper, his plan clearer. He traced wires on a small diagram of the neighborhood power grid, his pencil moving carefully, marking the lines that connected the HOA office and Karen's house. He folded the diagram and placed it with the documents, his silence unbroken. Outside Karen's lights blazed late into the night, her laughter once more spilling across the street. But neighbors no longer laughed as easily. Some looked uncomfortable. Some excused themselves early. They too had begun to feel the weight of the man's silence pressing through the windows. While Karen drowned in noise, he built his storm in silence, patient, steady, each document, each note, each quiet step preparing for the day when her empire of paper lies would collapse with one strike. The night deepened, his lamp still glowed, his pen still scratched. The bill that was meant to crush him now lay at the bottom of the drawer, forgotten, because he knew it was not his burden, it was her mistake, and he was ready to make her pay for it in ways she could never imagine. The morning sun rose brightly but the air in the neighborhood felt heavy. Karen stepped out of her house dressed in her usual red jacket, her chin high, Her lips curled into a proud smile. She walked down the street like a queen inspecting her land. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and porches. Some waved nervously, others avoided her gaze. She did not care. She wanted them to see her power. She wanted them to know that she had broken the man across the street. She stopped near a group of neighbors tending their garden and began speaking loudly so others could hear. She told them the outsider had finally learned his place. She bragged that his $5,000 bill was only the beginning. If he dared challenge her again, she would double it, maybe even triple it. She laughed as if it was a joke, but her eyes carried cruelty. The neighbors forced small smiles. Some nodded quickly just to end the moment. But when she turned away, their faces showed doubt. Karen continued her parade, walking to house after house, boasting that she was protecting community values, that without her the neighborhood would fall into chaos. She painted herself as a savior. While secretly enjoying the fear she inspired, children stopped playing when she passed. Adults lowered their voices. Yet behind her back whispers had already started to change. Some said she had gone too far. Some whispered that her pride would destroy her. But Karen ignored it all, blind to the shift. Across the street the man watched from his window, his face calm, his eyes unblinking. He saw her gestures, her exaggerated laughter, her hands waving in the air as if she were a ruler speaking. To her subjects, he studied her carefully, every movement, every word. Then let the curtain fall back into place. He returned to his desk where the folder of documents sat waiting. He opened it again, his hands steady. Flipping through stamped pages and notes, the evidence clear, the truth undeniable. Karen thought she was tightening her grip, but in reality she was building the very rope that would strangle her authority. Later that afternoon Karen called another gathering. This time in the open park at the center of the neighborhood. She brought her closest allies, the board members who still clung to her power. They set up chairs and a podium. Karen stood tall before the crowd, her voice booming. She repeated the story of the man's humiliation. She called him reckless. She mocked his silence. She told the neighbors that she would crush him completely if he dared to resist. Some clapped, some laughed nervously, but others stayed quiet, their eyes shifting toward the man who once again stood at the back, calm, silent, watching. His presence unsettled them. He did not speak, he did not defend himself. But his steady gaze made Karen's loud words feel weaker. Karen noticed his eyes on her and raised her voice even higher. She said silence was nothing but surrender, that he had no courage to fight. She laughed as though she had won already. But when her laughter ended, the hush that followed felt heavier than her speech. The neighbors looked from her to him, comparing her noise to his silence. She forced the crowd to clap, raising her arms dramatically. But when the meeting ended, people walked away quickly, whispering more than cheering. Karen returned home flushed with pride, telling herself she had defeated him again. She poured herself a glass of wine and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw power, control, dominance. She believed her empire was untouchable. But deep inside her chest, a small tremor of unease still lingered. She remembered his eyes, calm and cold. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself silence meant weakness. Yet she could not shake the thought that perhaps his silence was not surrender but something else, something stronger. Meanwhile in his house the man sat under the lamp's dim light. The diagram of the power grid spread out before him, his notes growing sharper, his plan clearer. He traced lines with his pencil, marking the exact points where control could be reversed. He stacked the documents neatly and closed the folder, his hands calm, his breath steady. While outside Karen drank and celebrated her imagined victory, he sharpened the storm that would soon strike. The street grew dark as night fell, but his house remained dim, silent, steady, while hers glowed like a lantern of arrogance, one that did not realize the wind was already rising to blow it out. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes every sound sharper. The man sat alone in his garage, the door shut, the light dim. The folder of documents was closed on the workbench, but spread before him now were tools, wires, diagrams, and old blueprints of the neighborhood power system. He had gathered them carefully, piece by piece, and tonight he began his first step. His hands were steady as he traced the thick lines of the power grid with his finger, noting where the HOA's office and Karen's house drew their electricity. Every wire was marked, every connection understood. He had studied it enough to know which switch controlled what. Outside the garage, the street slept, but the air carried whispers. Neighbors had started to question, started to doubt Karen's control. Yet fear kept them silent. The man worked without a Sound, each movement deliberate, his tools clicking softly. He tested circuits, marked breakers, and wrote notes in his small notebook, his eyes sharp, his silence colder than steel. Across the street Karen's lights still blazed. Her house glowed brighter than all others. Inside she laughed over the phone with another board member, telling them how she had humiliated the outsider, how his silence proved her victory. She spoke of her plans to fine him further, maybe force him to sell his house. Her laughter carried through the night, arrogant and sharp, but in the shadows of his garage the man did not flinch. Her words meant nothing here. Here he built something she could never imagine. Hours passed. The notebook filled with lines and numbers. He stood and walked quietly through his yard, moving like a shadow, checking the poles, the meters, the boxes the HOA thought they controlled. He touched each one, felt the hum of the current, studied the locks and seals. He knew which were weak, which could be bypassed, which lines fed directly into the office that Karen used as her throne. The night grew colder but his movements stayed steady. He returned to the garage and laid out heavy gloves, insulated cutters, and a small device he had built from spare parts. It was simple but powerful. One flip and the current would stop. One twist and darkness would fall. He tested it carefully, the click loud in the silence, then tucked it away. His calm face gave away nothing, yet in his chest. The storm grew sharper. This was not rage, not recklessness, but patience turning into precision. The first step was almost complete. The next day he acted as though nothing had changed. He walked the street calmly, his expression unreadable. He greeted no one, answered no questions. Karen strutted past him in her red jacket, smirking. She asked if he was ready to pay, if he had learned his lesson. He only looked at her once, his eyes cold, then walked on. She laughed loudly, but something in her chest tightened. That silence was beginning to frighten even her. That evening he entered the garage again, tightening bolts, checking connections, running one final test. Everything was ready. He sat on the stool staring at the diagrams, the tool in his hand, his face calm. Outside the sky darkened. Lights came on across the neighborhood. Children called out to each other. Families settled into their routines. Karen's house burned brightest of all, her laughter spilling through open windows. She had no idea that her throne sat on wires thinner than thread. Wires the man now controlled. He closed the notebook, slid it into his drawer, and turned off the garage light, standing in the dark for a long moment, his breath steady, his silence unbroken. The first step had been taken, and though Karen still danced in her imagined victory, the man knew the power she flaunted so carelessly could be stripped away in a second. He walked back into his house, closed the door softly, and sat by the window, watching her light blaze, his eyes cold, his face calm, the storm inside him whispering that soon, very soon, her laughter would echo into darkness, and the neighborhood would see who truly held the power. The next morning the man woke early, the sun barely rising above the rooftops. The neighborhood was still sleepy, birds chirped faintly, and the air felt heavy with the kind of quiet that comes before something changes. He sat at his table with a cup of coffee, the bitter steam rising slowly. The folder of documents lay closed, untouched. Today was not about papers, today was about words. For days he had stayed silent, watching Karen brag and laugh, letting her believe she had won. But now it was time to give her a chance, a warning, one last path before the storm broke. He placed the empty cup down, stood, and walked outside, his steps steady, his eyes cold. Across the street Karen stood in her yard, her red jacket on, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. She was laughing, telling someone how she had crushed him with the $5,000 bill, how the outsider was powerless. She noticed him walking toward her and raised her chin, her laughter growing sharper. She ended the call and folded her arms, waiting as if daring him to speak. He stopped a few feet away, his face calm, his voice quiet but clear. He told her she had gone too far, that the bill was fraud, that the power she thought she had was slipping. His tone was steady, not loud, but each word carried weight. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, surprised to hear him speak at last. Karen blinked once, then laughed loudly, her voice carrying through the street. She called him a fool. She mocked his calmness. She said his silence had been nothing but fear. She waved her hand as if brushing away dust. She told him that if he refused to pay, she would double the fines, triple them. She would bury him in debt until he crawled on his knees. Her laughter rang like broken glass. The neighbors who watched from a distance felt uneasy. some shifted uncomfortably, expecting him to snap, to shout. But he did not. He only stood there, letting her words spill out, his eyes never leaving hers, his silence cutting deeper than anything he could say. When her laughter finally slowed, he spoke again, his voice low, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. He told her this was her last chance, that what she had built was fragile, that one wrong push would send it crashing down. Karen's smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Then she barked another laugh, calling him insane. She leaned closer and sneered. That she was the HOA, that she controlled the streets, the homes, even the air they breathed. She told him he was nothing, just one man standing against an army. The neighbors gasped quietly, her words too loud, too arrogant. But she didn't notice, blinded by her own pride. The man finally nodded once, slowly, his eyes colder than ever, then turned and walked away without another word. Karen shouted after him, demanding he come back, mocking his retreat. But his silence was heavier than her shouts. It wrapped around her like a shadow, and though she laughed, deep inside her chest something shifted, something uneasy. That night Karen gathered her board members in the community hall. She slammed her hand on the table, retelling the scene with venom. She mocked the man's warning, called it pathetic. She swore he would pay. She told them to prepare new rules, harsher fines, bigger punishments. Some of them nodded nervously, but their eyes betrayed doubt. They had heard his words too. They had seen his calm face. They felt the weight of his silence pressing on the room. Meanwhile the man sat in his garage again. The diagrams spread before him, his tools ready, his gloves set neatly on the workbench. He moved slowly, carefully, checking the device he had built, flipping the switch once, the click loud in the still air. He imagined the neighborhood in darkness, Karen's house glowing 1 second and vanishing the next. He placed the device back down gently, his face calm, his breath steady. Outside Karen's house blazed with light, her laughter spilling once again into the night. She believed she had humiliated him. She believed she had silenced his warning. But she was blind to the truth. His silence had not been fear. His warning had not been empty. It had been her final chance, and she had thrown it away with her pride. Now the storm he carried within was ready to strike, ready to shatter her empire. As he turned off the garage light and stood in the darkness, he whispered nothing. But his silence promised everything, and soon, very soon, Karen would understand what it meant to ignore a quiet man's warning. The night was warm but the air carried an uneasy stillness. The neighborhood seemed calm on the surface. Yet whispers of doubt had already spread from house to house. Karen had spent the entire day parading through the streets in her red jacket, reminding everyone that she was in control, that the man across the street had been humiliated. She told them the $5,000 bill would break him. She told them he had no power, but behind their forced smiles neighbors were growing restless. They had seen his eyes, they had heard his warning. They had felt the weight of his silence. Now the sun had set, children were called inside, porch lights flicked on, and Karen gathered her closest allies in the HOA office at the corner of the street. She stood at the front of the room with her arms folded, boasting about how she would double fines, expand her reach, make sure no one ever questioned her again. Her laughter rang through the office windows and spilled out into the street. Across from her the man sat in his garage, the lamp casting a dim circle of light around him. The diagrams of the power grid spread across the table, his gloves on, his tools arranged neatly, the small device resting in his hand. He turned it over slowly, his face calm, his breath steady. He did not think of revenge with rage. He thought of balance, of truth, of silence heavier than noise. He stood and moved quietly through his yard, the night wrapping around him like a cloak. He reached the service pole near his property, the wires humming faintly. His hands moved with precision, steady and unhurried. He clipped one line, twisted another, and set the device in place. The switch waited, small, simple, but powerful. His eyes lifted toward the HOA office glowing with arrogant light. Inside Karen raised her voice higher, mocking him again, declaring that his warning meant nothing, that his silence proved weakness. The board members laughed nervously, clapping too loudly, hoping to hide their fear. Outside the man placed his hand on the switch, his face still calm, no anger, no smile, only silence. Then with one firm motion he flipped it. The click echoed in the night. A heartbeat later every light in the HOA office flickered and died. The room was swallowed in darkness. Screams erupted, chairs scraped, papers fell, voices shouted in panic. Neighbors stepped out of their houses, confused. The street lights that fed through the HOA grid blinked out one by one. Leaving half the neighborhood in shadow, Karen's voice screamed from the dark, ordering people to stay calm, demanding answers, her words frantic, her pride cracking. The man stood in his yard watching quietly. The glow of her house vanished. Her throne of light snuffed out. Across the street people gasped. Children cried. Flashlights flicked on. Shadows moved quickly, chaos replacing order. Karen stumbled through the office, her voice shrill, calling for generators, shouting at board members. But they ignored her. Fumbling in panic, outside neighbors whispered, some covering their mouths, some already laughing. Softly, for the first time in years Karen's power had vanished, literally. The dark wrapped around her empire like chains. She burst out of the office doors with a lantern in hand, her face twisted with rage and fear. She shouted that it was sabotage, that someone would pay. Her eyes darted toward the man's house, but she froze when she saw him standing by his fence, calm, silent, watching. The lantern light flickered against his face, making his gaze colder. Her voice cracked as she screamed. His name, accusing him, threatening him. But her words fell flat, drowned by the whispers of neighbors who had gathered. Their eyes no longer afraid, their voices no longer hushed. They saw her for what she was, powerless in the dark, her throne broken, her crown invisible. The man did not reply. He did not move. He only turned slowly and walked back into his house, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Karen screaming at shadows. The neighbors stared at her, some shaking their heads, some smiling faintly. Her empire had been built on fear and light, and now both were gone. The blackout lasted long into the night. The man sat inside, his house dim but calm. He poured himself a glass of water, set it down, and listened to the chaos outside. Every scream from Karen, every whisper from neighbors, every crack in her pride was a sound louder than victory. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing slowly, his silence complete. And in that silence the neighborhood realized what Karen had refused to believe. The man she mocked as weak had the power to plunge her world into darkness, and she had no weapon strong enough to fight it. The blackout stretched deep into the night. The neighborhood, once bright and controlled by Karen's iron grip, was now nothing but shadows and whispers. Inside the HOA office chaos reigned. Board members stumbled with flashlights. Papers scattered across the floor. Chairs knocked over. Karen's voice screeched louder than ever. She shouted at them to restore the power. She cursed the electric company. She demanded obedience. But her words bounced off panicked walls. No one listened the way they once did. Her allies fumbled in silence, some looking at her with fear, others with doubt. Outside, families lit candles in their homes. Children huddled close to their parents. Neighbors gathered in small groups whispering about the sudden darkness. Some laughed quietly, saying it was deserved, saying maybe fate itself had turned against Karen. Others spoke of the man, their eyes glancing toward his house, calm and steady with only a faint lamp glowing inside. Karen stormed out of the office with a lantern clutched in her trembling hands. Her face pale yet flushed with fury, she screamed into the night that this was sabotage, that someone would pay. She shouted the man's name again and again, accusing him, pointing toward his dark house. But the crowd that had gathered outside no longer gasped in fear. Instead they murmured softly, their whispers rising into something Karen could not control. She tried to silence them with threats, waving her lantern like a weapon, but her voice cracked. Her words no longer sharp. They were desperate, and desperation was something her neighbors had never seen in her before. The man stepped out onto his porch, calm as ever, his hands resting at his sides, his face unreadable. Karen froze when she saw him, her lantern shaking, her breath ragged. She shouted at him to admit it, to confess, but he said nothing. He stood there in silence, and that silence carried more weight than her screams. The neighbors turned their eyes from Karen to him, their fear shifting, their loyalty breaking. Karen's panic grew. She shouted louder, tripping over her own words, promising punishments, threatening lawsuits, even begging for obedience. But no one moved, no one answered. Her board members slipped quietly into the crowd, some even leaving altogether, unwilling to tie themselves to her collapsing power. She spun in circles, her lantern light flickering wildly. The once proud queen of the neighborhood now looked like a lost figure stumbling in the dark. Children giggled from the shadows. Mothers hushed them quickly, but the laughter cut into Karen like a blade. She screamed for silence, but only her own voice answered. Inside her chest her heart raced. Sweat clung to her brow. Her grip on the lantern loosened. She was unraveling before everyone's eyes, and nothing she did could stop it. Meanwhile the man stepped back inside his house, closing the door softly. The gesture so small yet louder than her entire tirade. Karen lunged toward his house, shouting that he was a coward, that he was hiding, but her words faltered when no one followed her. She turned back and saw the crowd watching, their expressions not fearful but curious, some almost amused. She stammered, trying to recover. But the silence of the crowd was unbearable. It crushed her louder than applause ever lifted her. She staggered back to her house, slamming the door, her lantern clattering to the floor inside. The windows glowed faintly but her empire of light was gone. The neighbors returned slowly too. Their homes, their whispers filling the street like a rising tide. They spoke of her panic, of her weakness, of her loss. And they spoke of the man, of his calmness, of his silence that seemed to control the night itself. Hours passed. The blackout continued. Karen sat in her living room surrounded by useless papers, her hair messy, her hands trembling. She clutched a glass of wine that spilled onto the floor. She replayed the scene again and again, the neighbor's stares, the man's silence, her own voice cracking. For the first time she felt the weight of fear pressing back against her. And it was heavier than anything she had ever placed on others. Across the street the man sat quietly by his window, watching her house flicker in the dim lantern light. His face calm, his breath steady, his silence absolute. And though Karen raged and panicked, though she screamed and cursed, the truth had already spread. The queen of fines and threats had been stripped of her throne by a single moment of darkness, and there was no light bright enough to hide her panic now. The blackout carried into the next morning. The sun rose slowly but the neighborhood was still unsettled. People stepped out of their houses yawning, holding cups of coffee, talking in low voices about the chaos of the night before. Children whispered about how scary it was when all the lights went out. Some even said it was exciting, but the adults spoke in hushed tones about Karen, about how she had screamed in the dark, how she had accused the man, how she had looked less like a leader and more like a desperate woman grasping at air. Karen herself had barely slept. She sat in her living room surrounded by cold coffee cups and crumpled papers. Her red jacket lay thrown on the floor, her hair tangled, her eyes wide with exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the man standing on his porch, calm, silent, his face unreadable. She tried to tell herself he was weak, that he was nothing, but the memory of the crowd's stares burned in her chest. The memory of their whispers cut deeper than any fine she had ever given. By mid-morning a county inspector's truck rolled into the neighborhood. A man in a uniform stepped out carrying a clipboard and tool bag. Neighbors came out to watch as he walked straight to the HOA office. Karen rushed out, her face flushed, trying to look in control. She told the inspector loudly that someone had sabotaged their power, that it was a crime, that it was all the outsider's fault. Her voice carried, but it cracked under strain. The inspector ignored her shouting and began examining the meters, tracing wires, checking the main lines. Neighbors gathered closer, whispering, some even smirking as Karen's panic grew. Then the man appeared, walking slowly down the street with his folder in hand, his steps calm, his eyes steady. The crowd parted for him without a word. He stopped near the inspector and opened the folder, presenting stamped documents. Official meter readings, proof of irregularities. He spoke in a low voice, steady and clear, explaining how the HOA had manipulated the numbers, how bills had been inflated, how power had been misused. The inspector's brow furrowed as he read. The crowd leaned closer. Karen's face went pale. She rushed to snatch the papers but the inspector pulled them away. His voice stern as he told her to step back. Her words stumbled. Her threats turned to excuses. She said it was a mistake, a clerical error, nothing serious. But the documents spoke louder than her trembling voice. The inspector asked questions, pointed out inconsistencies, and the man answered each one calmly, showing receipts, dates, proof of normal usage. Then the sudden, impossible spike. His voice carried truth without anger, his silence between sentences more powerful than Karen's shouting. Neighbors gasped as they realized what was unfolding. Karen had not punished him. She had exposed herself. Her empire built on fraud and arrogance was crumbling in front of everyone. The inspector shook his head, his voice heavy as he said he would file an immediate report, that the evidence was undeniable, that an investigation would begin. Karen screamed, calling it lies, calling it sabotage, but no one believed her anymore. Her board members stood at the edge of the crowd, their faces pale, some already slipping away quietly, abandoning her. The neighbors began to murmur louder, their whispers no longer afraid. Some laughed openly, others nodded toward the man with gratitude. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves asking if Karen would be gone soon. Karen spun in circles, shouting at them to stay quiet, threatening fines. But the words sounded hollow. Meaningless. The inspector closed the folder, thanked the man, and said he had all he needed. Karen stumbled forward, begging now, saying the HOA was the only thing keeping order, that without her the neighborhood would collapse. But the neighbors did not cheer her. They did not agree. They only stared, their silence reflecting the man's silence, a mirror that crushed her pride. The man closed his folder slowly, tucked it under his arm, and walked back toward his house, his steps steady, his face calm. Karen shouted after him, but he did not turn. He did not answer. He only walked on, and his silence was louder than her screams. That evening, when the sun fell and the street lights flickered back on under the inspector's temporary repairs, the neighborhood felt different. People smiled openly. Some even clapped when they passed each other. The spell of fear was broken. Karen sat alone in her darkened office, her papers scattered, her hands trembling, her power slipping like sand. Through her fingers, across the street the man sat by his window, the faint light of his lamp glowing, his eyes calm as ever, his silence unbroken. The truth had been revealed, the fraud exposed, and the storm he had promised with his quiet warning had finally arrived, leaving Karen's empire shattered in the open for everyone to see. The final blow came quietly, not with Karen's shouting, not with her board members' meetings, not with another fine, but with silence heavier than all the noise she had created for years. The county's decision arrived a week later, a stamped notice declaring the HOA dissolved, the fraud confirmed, the documents undeniable. Neighbors gathered in the street as the inspector posted the paper on the community board, eyes wide, hearts pounding. For years they had lived under Karen's rules, her endless fines, her threats, her arrogant laughter, and now with one simple sheet of paper it was gone. The crowd broke into cheers. Some hugged, some cried, children danced on the sidewalks, their laughter rising higher than it ever had, and in the middle of it all Karen stood frozen, her red jacket wrinkled, her face pale, her lips trembling. She tried to tear the notice down, but the inspector stopped her with a sharp warning. Her hands shook, her pride cracked. She shouted that it was a mistake, that she would appeal, that they needed her. But her words carried no weight. The neighbors no longer feared her. Their silence crushed her louder than applause. She stumbled back toward her house, her eyes wet, her voice breaking. But no one followed, no one supported. She was alone. Across the street the man stepped out of his house, his steps steady, his folder tucked under his arm though he no longer needed it. The crowd parted for him, whispers rippling through the air. Some called out thank you, some nodded respectfully. But he said nothing. He simply walked forward, calm and silent, his eyes scanning the street he had quietly freed. Karen saw him and screamed his name, her voice desperate, accusing him of destroying her life. But he did not even glance at her. He passed her like she was nothing more than an echo fading into the air. Her screams grew weaker, her body shaking. She dropped to her knees on the sidewalk clutching her useless papers, the wind catching them, scattering them across the street like trash. The neighbors watched silently, some pitying her, others smiling, but none helping. The man reached the end of the street and stopped for a moment. He looked back, not at Karen, but at the neighborhood, at the people now free, his eyes calm, his face unreadable. Then he turned again and walked on, disappearing slowly into the horizon, the sun catching his shoulders, his silence louder than victory chants. In the days that followed the neighborhood changed, fences repainted, gardens grew wild and free, children played without fear, laughter filled the streets. The air itself felt lighter. People spoke openly, no longer lowering their voices. The fear that had once ruled them was gone. And though they celebrated, though they lived freer, one image never left their minds. The man's silence, steady, cold, unshaken. It had been his only weapon and it had destroyed the empire Karen built on pride. Karen herself became a shadow, sitting alone in her darkened house, curtains drawn, neighbors passing her window without a second glance. She shouted sometimes, cursed the man, cursed the neighbors, but no one listened. Her words bounced off empty walls. Her empire had ended, her crown shattered, her throne gone. She was nothing but noise in a world that had finally chosen silence. Across the street the man lived as he always had, quiet, steady, never boasting, never demanding thanks. He walked through the neighborhood with calm steps, and people moved aside for him. Their nods filled with respect, their whispers filled with awe. He had not shouted, he had not threatened, he had simply waited, prepared, and when the time came, he had struck with silence sharper than any blade. The story spread beyond the street, carried to other neighborhoods, told like a warning and a legend. That one man brought down an HOA built on fear, not by anger but by patience, not by noise but by calm. His silence became a tale parents told their children, a reminder that power built on arrogance cannot stand, that the quietest storms are often the most destructive. And Karen, once the queen of control, once the voice that ruled over everyone, faded into nothing, her name whispered only as a caution, while the man's silence lived on, not as emptiness, but as victory, final, complete, eternal.